Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this framing panel discussion that is part of the Distinct Order, a curatorial project organized by the British Council. A Distinct Order is curated by Roopesh Sitharan and is part of Old World Order, New World Orders, a program from We Are Here, Artist Moving Image developed by Tendai John Mutambu, British Council, and LUX. It's a series of powerful and thoughtful programs that have been put together by Roopesh and Tendai, and they are available for viewing on December 11th and 12th. And in this particular conversation framing, we will be hearing about the conceptual premise for their curatorial decisions and approach. The curators will be discussing how categories of thought and critique in their curatorial practice unearths legitimate ways of making visible the suppression of orders, and we can unpack what these orders may be in a little while. My name is Mark Tay. I'm a performance maker, researcher, and curator based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I also work as the collective coordinator for Five Arts Centre. We're a group of artists, producers, and activists that was formed in 1984. I'm a 40-year-old Malaysian man with mixed Hokkien, Teochew, and Vietnamese backgrounds. I have black hair that is just graying a little bit at the sides, and I'm wearing a short sleeve blue shirt. Yeah. It is my great pleasure to join Tendai and Roopesh today in conversation about the programs that they have put together. We also have Lucy, who is doing interpretation for us on screen as well. So please let me introduce Tendai and Roopesh in turn. I will be reading from their bios that I've cobbled together. So just let me read this. So Tendai John Mutambu is a Zimbabwe-born New Zealand-based curator, film programmer, writer, and editor. Tendai is presently working as acting curator at Tere Uru, Waitakere Contemporary Gallery, and simultaneously serving as an assistant producer on artist filmmaker Aura Satz's first feature-length film, Preemptive Listen. Until recently, Tendai was a commissioning editor for essays in the publication Art Now, and his past experience includes guest co-curating an online edition of South London Gallery's Forum for Emerging Artists and Writers, the CONC, as well as working as assistant curator of commissions and public programs at Spike Island in Bristol, the UK. Tendai is also the curator for We Are Here, this big series of artists moving image film programs from the collection of British Council and LUX, from which we are drawing one series for the KL edition. On to Roopesh. Roopesh Sitharan is a curator, artist, researcher, and educator who specializes in new media, cultural studies, visual cultures. And since returning to Malaysia in 2018, after more than a decade in San Francisco and London, Roopesh has been based at the Faculty of Creative Multimedia University, where he presently serves as the Deputy Dean for Research, Industrial Collaborations, and Engagement. As an artist, he has exhibited very widely. Just this year alone, his work has been exhibited in screen and exhibitions and festivals that span Croatia, New Zealand, South Korea, the UK, and Malaysia. Roopesh and a collaborator also participated in the Academy of Sciences Malaysia's Art Science Prize with an award-winning project called Artificial Autonomy and the Question of Subjectivity of Artificial Intelligence. He's been involved in curating many projects. One of the most recent this year is Object Matters, Emancipating the Collection of Rahimi Harun at AP Art Gallery. And I was very lucky to work with Roopesh again on this project. We are longtime friends and collaborators. So welcome, Tendai, Roopesh, and Lucy after this very long and elaborate introduction. But I thought it's important to give people some background about where you're coming from. Yeah. I would like to maybe start off with asking both of you how you got your starts in curating or programming moving image or video art or experimental video? I know these words sometimes are used interchangeably, but if we could just start there, perhaps Tendai?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Mark, Shauza, and Roopesh for the kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you, Lucy, for interpreting. So just a quick self-description. I'm Tendai. I'm a dark-skinned Black New Zealander. My pronouns are he, him, his, but I don't mind they, them, theirs. I'm wearing a light beige bucket hat with mid-length hair. It's peeking out from behind. I have on a pair of spectacles with a thin gold wire frame and a light pink shirt with black vertical stripes. I think that's enough. So yeah, now to the question, how did I get into this line of work? So I studied law and art history at university, and then in my final semester, I ran off. I abandoned. There was a curatorial assistant role that came up, which looked really appealing. This was at a small non-collecting arts gallery in Auckland. It's called Art Space New Zealand. It was called Art Space New Zealand at the time. Now it's called Art Space Aotearoa, which is the indigenous name for New Zealand. And at the time, when I'd done my postgraduate studies at university, I was focusing on contemporary art. But it wasn't until I was at Art Space doing the curatorial assistant role that I kind of felt a sort of a push towards artist film and video. So we'd shown some of the best work, I think, we'd shown from artists beyond the borders of New Zealand were works by artists working with film and video, including Harun Faroki, Hito Steil, Mauro Asanios, who's Germany-based Lebanese filmmaker. And so when I got to work on my first exhibition, I also presented and commissioned some moving image work, including by Martine Sims, an African-American film and video artist, and Sarawat Songsat, who is a Thai-born, New Zealand-based filmmaker. And so by the time I moved to the UK like a few years from then, I realized, I guess I had this wealth of experience and exposure to film and video. And I luckily got a job working for the London Film Festival in one of their training positions. And at the time, Ben Cook, who was the director of Lux in London, was in charge of co-directing Experimenta. Experimenta was their, or still is, I should say, the artist moving image section of the London Film Festival. Right. So then that led to this project with Lux and British Council. So after that, Ben invited me to work with the Lux collections and the British Council collections. And that's sort of how I cut my teeth, I suppose.
Wow, that's really great. Thanks for that introduction, Tendai. I'm really curious about this law background as well, because these notions of law and order is something that we can unpack a little bit as well later. Roopesh, what about you, Roopesh? Tell us about how you kind of got involved with curating video art. I think it's the term that we tend to use more in Malaysia. Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Mark. Thank you for that, Tendai. Thank you all for the invitation as well. I'm grateful, and it's really an honor to be joining for today's discussion. And it's also a great platform to discuss some of the ideas we have. So before going ahead, let me describe myself. I'm an Asian descent. I have a rather messy dark hair, and I'm wearing a opaque pattern t-shirt. So I think that's sufficient. I don't have a mustache, nor a beard. I'm clean shaven. So having said that, I think my entry specifically to the curating rather comes from my background in media studies, and also importantly in terms of the sort of conditions of the situation in Malaysia where there is lack of critical discourse and discussion, especially surrounding the areas of media-related art practices. So this does not mean there hasn't been anything happening in distance, such as First Electronic Art Show, and I can name drop a few people such as Professor Hasnol and Associate Professor Naranjan, some key figures, and Ismail Zain, especially in the Malaysian context, as the key figures in thinking about electronic art as how they call it in the Malaysian context. But specifically thinking about video works, we do not, I have to say, we do not have a specific sort of institutionalized category as so, but importantly, we have this sort of disbursement of or emergence of use of video as part of a creative practice that comes on and off generally across contemporary art practice. And we also have a separate branch that looks into independent filmmaking. So my interest specifically coming from media studies, looking at technology-based art practice, and that led me into thinking about internet-based works and network-based art, which eventually led me into thinking about videos, because videos, I believe, now have evolved into becoming a synonym or very household names in terms of thinking about content online, especially with the streaming services, as well as other sorts of social media platform where they have embed videos as part of their content. So that is my entry point in really thinking about this, thinking about creating discourse along this line of practice that I do. And really that led me in terms of thinking about video specifically as a domain of art practice and what it means to the Malaysian context. And that eventually led me into thinking about video per se. So having said that, I think I also operate pretty diverse into various sort of roles. So to some extent, I was invited by Shaza and the British Council, looking at my background, I suppose, and also thinking about what sort of response or discourse that I could bring to the table by looking at the works of my friend Tendai. So that is, in a nutshell, what has happened and where I'm coming from.
No, that's really great. Thanks, Roopesh, for sharing this kind of, comprehensive but also like expansive kind of context for your own path, but also that in the Malaysian strand of looking at maybe moving image, as with many other places, we are really kind of collaging from different strands and streams of independent cinema, experimental cinema, as well as electronic art. You referenced the works of Ismail Zain, Hasnul Jamal Saidon, and Niranjan Raja, and they remain really important figures. Roopesh, I'll just stay with you for a little bit. If I try and narrow a little bit the field and extend what you mentioned about coming from a media practice, when you approach curating a program of screen-based works, let's say, what are some principles or general things that you keep in mind, whether it's kind of thematics or maybe art historical or even discursive kind of frameworks? What's important to you? Like what do you kind of work with or resist against, perhaps?
I think for me, my attraction starts in thinking about the way in which how these sort of mediums operate or linger within the practice of fine arts. So how they are being acknowledged or how they are being marked, whether it's through art history, whether it's through some sort of a casual discourse, whether it's through some form of exhibition making, or as simple as a screening event. So the way in which how these mediums actually enters into the realm of creative practice, quote unquote, especially coming from artists, that becomes a sort of attraction for me to think about these works. So I start from that point in thinking about how do I use the curatorial or the curatorial practice as a way in means to have a discussion around this sort of emerging practices that's coming in our local scene, put it that way, in that sense. And I think this is also in very much concerns in terms of the urgency of these practices, broadly speaking, in terms of entering into the larger discourse or the canonical discourse of art history or even art per se, generally art practices in Malaysia. So there is an urgency in that sense. But as importantly, also above that, I also feel it needs proper representation in that sense, in terms of how it's being portrayed or accessed by the public. So there is some form of a niche kind of insider sort of presentation that is, to some extent, it's closed off to the public. So it needs a lot of heavy lifting in terms of introducing to the public, introducing the sort of a discourse to a larger sort of academics or even practitioners, so that they understand and they can also participate in this sort of video art. So to some extent, answering your question directly, Mark, I think my strategy for the curatorial comes from this concern and love for these practices, right? Care for these practices. So those drives, so the way in which I care actually dictates the way in which how I want this to be discussed about, whether in terms of acknowledging these practices, marking these practices, discussing about these practices, or even as simple as making visible the sort of medium and the practices that we are talking about here. In this case, we're talking about moving images.
No, that's really great. Thanks, Roopesh. I think this notion of latency and kind of tracking the imminence of different practices and how it kind of frictions against or rubs up against the canonical is something that both of you, I sense, do in your practices, whether it's through curatorial practice, but also associatedly in your writing works, as well as in education. Tendai, what about you? Could you share about some of the primary concerns that you have? I understand you also have an art historical background, and you've worked quite extensively in different contexts as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that Roopesh mentioned kind of resonate or apply to my own situation. But I guess in terms of the context that I've worked in, primarily museums and galleries, but also having done some work for film festivals as well, I'm always sort of moving between those different worlds. Yeah. And I suppose one of the film festivals that I worked for in the north of England, Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival, has it has both a cinema-based presentation model as well as installations, and kind of live art, public programming that goes alongside this. So in a way, it sort of has this very expansive take on the moving image. It offers like a very wide range, and that was quite early on in my training as well. So I feel like that's sat with me, and it's something that I've taken with me in working in sort of more conventional gallery spaces, for want of a better term. But in terms of the actual kind of the substance of what I'm working with, I'm hoping to kick off something in the new year. That's sort of, at the moment, the working title is Black Essayism, and I've been looking at the use of the essay film as a kind of a genre within the moving image, and a lot of contemporary artists, a lot of them Black British, some of them African American, and others of the African diaspora spread out all across the world, and how they're sort of influenced by a history of essay filmmaking. It's sort of like its loose, digressive qualities, the sort of freedom, the liberties that it takes with the form, in a way, or the liberties that it takes with sort of like cinematic histories, and playing with image and sound in a very like playful and often, very creative way. But what I'm interested in is sort of like getting my head around the canonical figures within that genre of the essay film, and thinking about how there were maybe practitioners who were working along the sort of same lines at a similar time, perhaps doing things that could be seen to be connected, that haven't made it into the canon. I suppose the first names that sort of come to mind when you think of that form is a lot of French filmmakers, René, Chris Marker, maybe Vada. I mean, they're mostly male, but like, yeah, Agnes Vada, I guess, thinking of a woman, Belgian, Chantal Ackerman. Yeah, a lot of white figures, put it that way. So I'm interested in who out there, and I know there's like, Black Audio Film Collective and Genre Confra readily come to mind as sort of like really significant contributors to that genre. But yeah, I want to get my head around what it means to be working in that form and how it's defined and how it has historically sort of excluded certain people. So that's sort of an example really of like the kind of things that I'm looking at. I'm like at one at the same time interested in the kind of institutional canonical and how it might be extended and expanded, and maybe even read against itself in a way, sort of read against its own grain, if you will. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks so much, Tendai. I think there's lots of resonances in the approaches and practices that you guys are doing at the kind of general level, and of course responding then to your own context. I mean, I would like to now maybe zoom in on the program that both of you kind of like put together in a combined way. This a distinct order, right? And this word order, which Roopesh has kind of latched onto in particular. I mean, it's a word that appears in both the titles of the programs that we are screening. Old World Order, New World Orders, as well as a distinct order. So riffing off this word for a little bit. I mean, I guess we could consider or refer to this term from multiple and divergent perspectives, right? There's this notion of the New World Order as a kind of geopolitical paradigm and a kind of anxiety, I guess, in the arena of international relations. In Southeast Asia, for example, we are very familiar with Orde Baru, or the New Order regime of Suharto, which lasted for 32 years in Indonesia, before it was brought down by the Reformasi movements in 1998. It's one of the very few reformist movements that actually succeeded in our regional context. At the same time, there's also all these kind of things like law and order, the epistemological kind of order of things, and obviously various attempts to decolonize and challenge these pre-existing frameworks, of which, of course, artists in their very poetic, creative, and critical ways are deeply engaging, and that's evident in the program. So, I mean, this is just the kind of general background when we can take this in lots of ways. But my question for Tendai maybe is, Tendai, if you could just speak a little bit about the larger context for the We Are Here program, which I also understand is taken from a quote from Stuart Hall. And what are some of the thematic threads that run through the program generally? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess that one of the initial ideas that I had in mind came from this quote, which hopefully I'm not misattributing. I'm pretty sure it's a Hall quote. It says, "We are here because you were there," and it's sort of a summation of, I guess, the position of the many diasporas that find themselves within the boundaries of Great Britain, if you will.
Yeah.
Right. So, on one hand, you have these aspects of British culture that find themselves in all the former colonies and so on and so forth, which is part of its mandate, really. Part of what it sought out to do was to spread its culture and mold the former colonies in its own image. But then now you also have within like a city like London, for example, which is where I'd moved to when I curated this. I just moved from New Zealand. I've been there for a few months, and then I could see obviously the workings of all these different cultural traditions, these sort of diasporic communities living within there. So I was thinking about what it meant to be curating this program or this series, which consists of 5 programs, as a Black Zimbabwean New Zealander who had just moved to the UK, curating under the auspices of the British Council, right, under this kind of British institution.
Lots of layers there.
There's lots of layers. And the way what kind of brought that together, along with, let's say, Malaysia as well, I guess, which is what makes this so sort of interesting, is this colonial history, this history of empire that we're kind of folded into. And so the first program that I did is this very one, which this one we're discussing, Old World Order, New World Orders, which is a bit of a mouthful. It was initially titled Old World Order, New World Disorders, but I think that was I got discouraged from the disorder. I think it was the negative connotation, but to be honest, I still prefer that because it was talking about the kind of the tensions at play, and of course Brexit is a significant part of the picture. It sort of loomed large when I'd moved to London. And you can see that in Callum Hill's work, for example, tracing the kind of this long history of a national identity and how it becomes very strained at particular points, or some more than others. I guess it always really is strained, always in contention. And then the other 4 programs, really, just to sum them really quickly, there's one called Songs from a Forgotten Past, and that's sort of looking at so-called ideas of marginality and representation and community, right? We hear these a lot, but what I was interested in particular was the framing that artists do, a kind of reframing of histories. So if we were to think of, say, failed historical projects, movements, as a sort of potential visions for the future. So in that way, it sort of shares something in common with Old World Order, in particular with like Morgan Quaintance's work, where you are revisiting archival material, historical material, and having sort of putting on it the lens of present contemporary discussions, using that to recast how we think of a particular point in history that sits within the popular imagination as one very simplified thing. Like, for example, in Morgan's case, it's the 1990s. The story of the 1990s in UK is pretty well worn. It's threadbare, kind of this played out idea of New Labour, Britpop, etc. It just is like kind of, it's cemented as that, really. And so he's trying to look at other alternative histories. And then another program is Radical Intimacies, which was thinking about diverse gender and sexual identities from an intergenerational perspective in particular as well, and thinking about ideas of desire and intimacy. And then the 4th program, Future Ecologies, was thinking about the environment, urban futures, and climate change, but in a very expansive way, right? So it's kind of to think of when the word ecology comes up, I guess it conjures certain images, in particular relations, but I was interested in artists who were kind of complicating that. For example, Charlotte Prodger's work really zeroes in on the idea of queerness, the queer body in rural space, how so often queerness is told through an urban lens, and what it would look like to cast it into somewhere provincial, for want of a better term, somewhere in the outdoors, and have it have a gendered body, a woman's body, in a space that is dominated by a very masculinist history, and a history of kind of like regional boundaries tied up with, particularly in the UK, sort of tied up with say football. The kind of regional flag shows up in one particular form in the work, and so on and so forth. And then the last program was a bit of like a bit of a wild card. I was like, okay, kind of tired of the whole thematic thing. So there was just some works really that I think that are playing around with photography, archival material, and sound, which, to be fair, all the other 4 have aspects of, but this one was just kind of like really just luxuriate in form and just think about the kind of potential that the moving image has in presenting this kind of material. Yeah.
Wow, thanks, Tendai. I mean, thanks for fleshing out these other kind of parallel orders that we won't be able to see. I'm super curious about the 4 other programs that are part of We Are Here, because they sound really rich and really kind of powerful. I think coming back to the question of what we're screening here in KL, or Malaysia rather, old world order, new world orders. I'm curious about, Roopesh, your response to the films that Tendai has programmed, just as a collection first, as an audience, really. Because before we are curators, we are audiences first, right? And I'm always really interested, I think, because you were based in the UK for most of the last decade. So a lot of this notions of Brexit, leaving the European Union, some of the kind of polarizations that are not unfamiliar to Malaysians were there, very present, before you returned to these shores in 2018. So your responses or your thoughts to old world order, new world orders.
I think first of all, I have to say it's really a well curated programs. First of all, when I looked through Tendai's all the works that were put together, in fact, I was really looking forward to have this sort of a conversation with Tendai and actually thinking about the sort of curatorial process. But really, Mark, I think you brought the important issue here, which is, I think for me, the position, the subjectivity of me as a person, right? Before audience, before curator, as a person who have actually been there, who actually have experienced the student strike, the sort of the build up to the Brexit, the sort of the election day, the election morning result. I was there during the entire process. So the sort of experience and the sort of changes that I've experienced, the sentiments of the people and the sort of the reactions to the result, and the sort of blocks that exist, right, for and against the sort of politics of the binary. So these were something I felt were very intimate and that informs my very subjectivity. So in that sense, that's why I felt these are very rich and dense contents, like very rich, and it has a strong residues and strong resonance towards me as a person. So that's why I think my initial reaction, like looking at these works, was like how do I talk about this sort of the resonance that I get as a person, and how do I talk about this kind of distinctions, the sort of individual experience that I have, and bring that into this whole thinking about the way in which I respond. So you can see it is coming from my subjective experience, just as you said, when I was there, the sort of experience, and how do I bring that out as some sort of a concept or a framework for me to think about the works that I want to put together for the Malaysian context. But importantly also, I also felt the sort of the necessity that is needed, right, for you to truly, really understand these works. So you need to be there, you need to understand the works, the context, the social, the politics of the situation, of the moment, of the time, and all that. So those are some of the demands that one need, or the works that actually they demand from the audience to truly, really understand these works. And it is, I wouldn't say it's the fault of the artist or the work, because the works are in response of a particular moment in time, right? They are specific to that particular moment. So in that sense, for us to unpack those moments definitely demands larger sort of body of knowledge. And that's where the whole institution's pedagogy and all that comes in. But however, I feel like this is an opportunity to actually think about this sort of specificity and also the distinctions or the peculiarity of the order in this case, right? So that's why, to some extent, this whole idea of a distinct order came into place, in terms of really now there's an opportunity here to really think about these specificities, these peculiarities, these specific demands that a work has upon the audience that could relate to this audience, and thinking about where these works are being presented to the Malaysian audience. So in that sense, there should be a sense of connections to this work that is coming from this country, from this region, and also the sort of association or affiliation that it could have with other sorts of struggle that's happening elsewhere in the world. But also, I do want to bring back to some of the ideas that Tendai was talking about, right? This sort of ideas, like for example, in Morgan's work, Another Decade, I think that was a very crucial and important work that really inspired me or become a trigger for me to think about the way in which I go about thinking about order is really looking at those era of 90s and the way in which how artists is responding, presenting all this. I mean, my reading of Morgan's work is like he's not proposing a new model. He's rather problematizing the sort of models that were proposed. There were many frames that was proposed, right? So there are many frames, there are many contestations. So how does one navigate through this sort of contestation, and how does one think about this? So for me, that allows for another sort of frame to also participate in this contestation. And that's where that's where to some extent I felt Hasnul's work in distinct order comes into play, but really looking about, it's not only a very macro global sort of struggle, thinking about this kind of a postmodern take on understanding the discourse, understanding the world, but also how does those sort of larger frameworks that are larger than itself actually becomes another sort of struggle on an individual, on a subjective level. How does one deal with that as a person to understand the world and to be part of this changing world, which is, I think, is very pertinent to the moment we're living in at this moment, like with this changing environment and changing situation and all that.
Yeah, Roopesh, maybe, like if I stay with you for a little bit, if I can just ask you to maybe expand a little bit about the program that you've put together. So you've already mentioned Hasnul's piece, which is like a really early, 1994 kind of a piece. I mean, it seems to me that you've put together a program that really troubles the order with the other in Malaysia. Right. So we're talking here about what I like to refer to, from my background in theater as like the multiculturalism that can be found or excavated in one body. It's, Christian Jit, the theater director, kind of mentions this. And of course, in at least 3 of the works, we are dealing with Malay artists who in many ways are also excavating the other within. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about these choices, because they also span a great amount of time, as well as Okuilala's work, which clearly performs and enacts the multicultural within her many selves.
Actually, if you think about it, I will come to the issue of multiculturalism. I mean, there's been a heavy critique on this whole idea of multiculturalism and how it operates, right? But before going into that, I think just to unpack the sort of distinct order, right? The way I was thinking, really is like having a concrete marker in actually identifying or introducing certain orders here, right? So for Hasnul, really, I'm thinking about this sort of order in discourse, like how does one participate in a discourse? Thinking about the sort of language, thinking about the sort of specific sort of way in which one articulates what order is. So in this sense, for Hasnul's work, you're talking about this sort of perumpamaan, in the sort of saying that goes like, frog under the coconut shell, which is usually referred to somebody who is, being trapped in a world on its own, in a bubble that does not know what's happening outside, So it's like, these sort of analogies that's being played out by the artist in actually breaking the coconut shell, doing those sort of ritualistic sort of performance and making video out of it. So it's like really talking about this sort of how one articulates order using certain sort of cultures, specific cultures, right? How it operates in terms of the articulation. And then thinking about Okui, really, I'm thinking about language itself comes to order things. Nothing escapes language, and this is what Okui's work does for me. Like really, the play of language and how it actually creates certain kind of ordering, whether a cultural distinction, a sort of identity, a sort of binary, whether you know the language or you don't, and how does that actually positions a person in the world. So those sort of another sort of ordering that I wanted to introduce. And importantly, language is an important aspect in the way in which how we order our society in Malaysia, the sort of struggles that we have in terms of thinking about national language, what it means as a nation for us, and how do we navigate throughout this sort of language politics in terms of the different races claiming the retainment of certain languages as part of vernacular studies and all that. Thirdly, also in terms of thinking about Gan Siong King's work, right? Really thinking about law and order. How does certain laws are there that actually comes to dictate how her subject operates in the world? So in many ways, we need those kind of orders. So that's why I felt, to some extent, I have to actually disagree with Tendai in that sense. For me, I actually feel the second part, what was it? New World Order, sorry, All World Order, New World Orders. The term orders, actually, I would prefer that over the disorder because to some extent, there is some sort of contradiction here. Right? We are not arguing for disorder. We are actually thinking about, we are actually problematizing the orders in saying the order is not simply creating certain kind of hierarchy, but it's much more complex. Like it's much more denser. It's much more complicated in a sense. Human experience is much more complex than just a black and white sort of an experience. So in that sense, I thought Gan Siong King's work, it speaks of that in a sense like there is a necessity for certain order. It's always there. It's there in the nature. It's there in the way in which how the world operates. However, this order also creates certain forms of marginalization, certain sorts of hierarchy. So how does one deal with that? And how does one goes about thinking about these sort of issues? And lastly, Ayn Rahman's work in really thinking about coming back to the, I mean, this is actually also influenced by the sort of accessibility that I had looking through all the programs that was curated by Tendai. So I thought there was a necessity to address the idea of gender and sexual identity. How does one engages these sort of issues, especially in the Malaysian context, and really thinking about this, what it means when somebody is not able to address this openly, what it means to address this with some sense of sensitivity towards culture, towards certain sort of beliefs, systems of beliefs, and certain sorts of respect, right? So how does one navigate this? While there is an urgency to undo, to introduce disorder, but there is nevertheless a sort of certain sorts of how do I say, sensitivity that one needs to navigate with. And this is something that I think very pertinent, especially people who are operating from the Asian culture to specific, I mean, not to stereotype the entire Asian culture, but generally to the non-Westerners, there is this sort of struggle that one needs to deal with. You know, you want to open this up, but there is certain limitations and levels in which, and pace in which you open this sort of discourse. So how does that navigate through those? Having said that, I think the listing order also actually ranges from a very senior artist to a very young emerging artist. There's also a spread of that in terms of actually trying to represent the sort of transformation or sort of transition that's happening in the practice itself in moving images, the practice of moving images, and also the sort of works that are coming from these domains. So there is also that. And importantly, also there is also the sort of opening up in terms of the sort of technique in creating moving images, how it was done during Husnul time, and how it's being used by Gan Siong King as a sort of an activist, a tool for an activism, and also in terms of forms of expression, in terms of Ayn Rahman's work. I hope that explains quickly a listing order. I tried.
Sure. Thanks, Roopesh. No, and thanks for teasing out actually some of these strands which are kind of embedded across and between these films really. Tendai, I'm curious about your responses to watching this collection that Roopesh has put together. And I know you have like a lot of experience of this touring We Are Here to lots of different contexts. So, I'm sure in each context there are kind of like different resonances and perhaps even dissonances. So just curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was really wishing I could see the work on a display beyond my laptop, but I enjoyed having access to it, and I liked this I guess one of the joys of film programming is sort of putting dissonant ideas next to one another, or at least what seems like seemingly dissonant, and then kind of seeing how they rub up against each other. And it is a sense, you mentioned, Roopesh, you were talking about your own kind of subjective experience of being in the UK. And somehow one of the reasons we sort of like, we gain some affinity with the work, or it sort of sticks with us as much, you know, the so-called content, but also what the form is doing to us, this sort of like affective, this emotional resonance in a way. And I think, you know, different ways of working with and working the medium can have these like different effects, even just sort of by dint of association with a certain particular history. Like I loved this, the post-colon one, that work, just on a very formal level, what it kind of took me to in terms of the sort of textures of video, the medium, and the histories and so on. But a kind of, yeah, a tongue-in-cheekness, a playfulness as well that comes through there. And I was just, yeah, and then I was moved by I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it correctly, but Katlaila? Kalela?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Just the kind of the tension that is held within the sort of the formal strategies, the play of sound and image, its sort of pace and rhythm and movement and so on, was so expertly done. I mean, it doesn't feel like it's 16 minutes at all, even though I know that's quite short, but what it manages to pack within such a short space of time is quite extraordinary. But also, I guess, dealing with things that are quite intense and quite harrowing without being too sentimental. In a sense, I think you see what is the kind of the struggle, really. And I'm drawn to work that informs us of the struggle, but without kind of locking us into the sentimentality that sort of fixates on a kind of helplessness or something. I think there's something incredibly empowering about that presentation and the work. And of course, having the my language proficiency really speaks to one of the concerns that I've had with this program, is to say, I mean, when it tours in different places, we often get subtitles in various languages. And there's also, speaking of orders, a kind of hierarchy of which languages you will choose to cast the work in, or to have the work presented in. And it has all kind of implications, obviously, including sort of like intra communal like tensions and so on. You know, like you have colonies within colonies almost type thing. So all those kind of ideas come out to play. And like you said, Roopesh, like language really becomes, it is sort of it is at the center of a lot of our, and I guess our orienting ourselves towards the world. But what I love is, you know, as artists are always going to be pushing something about the visual and the sonic will try and push us beyond language. Something that sort of seems to try and escape our grasp. Obviously, we're going to keep trying to grasp at it with, you know, the discourse and the conversation and so on. But there is that excess that spills over in the form of like our impressions of the work, the kind of emotional, like I said, the emotional resonances, the residues that it leaves beyond our capacity to sort of exhaust it with language. And I think the paradox, the Raman work, the paradox of philocely, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly, sort of had that sense where it is operating on a very sensory level, a kind of sensuousness of body and touch and sort of movement, purposefully ambiguous kind of thing about it, where it takes us into the realm of you know, beyond voiceover and speech and language, and it's taking us to something that's sort of a little bit more more sensory, more haptic, perhaps, which I loved. So within that program, you have like so many different registers. You could say so many different orders of thought, because I think of order as sort of connected to science and the taxonomic, this desire to place things into particular categories, into genres and subgenres. And here you have these works operating on so many different levels, which to me makes it makes for good viewing. it makes for good viewing. That variety, that on an intuitive level, there are just these different textures and tonalities to the work. So yeah, I think it's such a great response to have, something that I was aiming for with my own, and I think to have this as a counterpart is yeah, really great.
Great, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, Tendai. I think in this last part, I kind of want to ask the both of you to prospect a little bit the future, if it's possible. I mean, jumping off from Morgan Quintence's film, Another Decade, which really acts as this kind of conjuncture and a bit of a bridge, because he uses material from the 1994 conference towards a new internationalism. Roopesh has already said that it really moved him. But at the same time, it was also around that time that Post-Colony, the suite of films by Hasno Jamal Saidon was made, when he was in another metropole in the United States, reflecting on cultural identity and using Malay proverbs. Of course, Another Decade, Quintence's film kind of takes us to reflect on the 90s and how these hauntings and resonances are still with us in very powerful and pervasive ways. But if we kind of turn the tables on this idea and look at the next decade, I'm wondering if we could end this session by each of you reflecting and prospecting on what are the challenges, the pleasures, and the potentials of curatorial practice more generally, but maybe also to moving images in your own work. I think it'd be a good place to end here. Yeah. Please, Roopesh or Tendai.
Roopesh, do you want to go?
I think, of course, nobody knows future, right? Nobody knows the future. One can hope for certain kind of outcome. But I think I would respond this by touching upon the term multiculturalism that you mentioned earlier, right, Mark?
Yeah.
And I think it's just for the benefit, just to clarify with our audience, you're actually referring to a term that was mentioned by Christian Jit, right, where he refers multiculturalism that is found in one body. That's how he would describe it. So I think it's very pertinent. But however, I think this is where, to some extent, I would hope for in the future. In a sense, I think I would like multiculturalism itself. For me personally, I feel it's laden with many problems, and there's been many criticism towards multiculturalism itself. And I think this is well known, well established, especially in the academic discourse. In the UK, especially, multiculturalism has been problematized, and its problem has been pointed out and such. However, for me, what is really pertinent about Christian Jit's description here is this idea of one body. So to some extent, I want to unpack this one body into three possibilities that I hope for in the future in terms of how I think about in my own practice. Firstly, I want to think about the body in terms of this sort of contradiction between solidarity and heterogeneity. So there is this body that needs to work as one, that needs to function as a single body, but the body also does not necessarily listen to the conscious subject all the time. There are certain parts in our body that operates on its own without even having us to think about those functions, right? The way in which our heart functions, the way in which our kidney and all those organs function, they do not wait for some kind of a response from our brain for those to function. So there is this sort of autonomy for the body to operate on its own, but there is also this sort of heterogeneity. I mean, there is this sort of difference in the body between the conscious subject and between the autonomy of a body as a living organism. So I think this is something that I really feel the sort of challenges that one faces in cultural practice. Like, how does one participate in some kind of order, but yet retain some sort sense of autonomy that is necessary to create some form of a friction or difference, to actually remind the body that there is something different that exists within, that is necessary for the body to function holistically as a living organism. So that's something that I think is necessary moving ahead. Secondly, also, I want to believe body is some sense of a way in which we engage the world through our senses. But importantly, there are limitations to these senses. So there are certain things that we can understand and we could comprehend. There are certain things that are beyond our comprehension, the limits of our body. So these limits are what is becoming very prevalent at the current moment we're living in more at this time. We have to reckon with the sort of limitations that we have as humans generally, right? There are certain things that are beyond the sort of things that are beyond our control, and these are becoming even very pertinent and important reckoning exercise that we need to embrace to some extent. And I think this is something important for us to move on into the future, especially coming from the arts. I think these are something that is really needs to be considered in the sort of articulation and the sort of debates that we want to bring into the table. Rather than mere representation of reality, we need to show the limits of representation so that these could be addressed in the art practice in that sense. And lastly, I want to think about non-human bodies. There are things that are outside our bodies. Things are not even considered as subjects, right? But yet they are there, yet they are very prevalent, yet they are very important and necessary for our survival. So I'm really thinking about this sort of Anthropocene kind of conditions that we live in that really demands us to think about what it means to be human, to live together with others. And this others here is not only bound within the cultural spheres of humans, but we are really thinking about aspects of larger than human, like the world at large, the universe, the conditions and the laws in which we have to abide by are not shaped or constructed by us, but it is there to make sure that we all could live in harmony with the others, and that others could be beyond humans. So thinking about these three aspects, and I think these ideas of coming from body, picking up from Christian Jit's description, I think this is how I would summarize it really for me personally in terms of my own practice. I think these are the current pressing, urgent matters that needs to be addressed. So I would end with describing with one of the latest projects that I'm working with called Lintas Laut. We are really looking about the ecological effects of what it means to be humans living in this current moment. Right? What are the sort of changes that we are doing to our living conditions, whether it could be cultural, whether it could be natural, and how are these changes are impacting? And importantly, how can artists respond to real world problems rather than merely becoming a reflection? How could they effectively not necessarily offer solutions, but point at the right direction and ask questions that are difficult, that does not necessarily give answers, but the question that needs to be asked at this moment in time. So these are the sort of things that really drive my practice to some extent and my thinking as a whole. I think with that I would end and I would pass it over to Tendai.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Roopesh. Sounds like a lot of work and heavy lifting for the future. We look forward to that. Tendai.
I think so much of that resonates with my own thinking and some of the stuff that I touched on with regards to that Future Ecologies program, which is part of the wider series. And I guess maybe to just go to a current project that I'm working on, which is maybe it'll exemplify some of the kind of key ideas. I am curating an exhibition for Te Uru in Auckland, which will open in June 2022. And it's a series of commissions, 5 new commissions of work by artists working in film and video using animation. And the kind of central premise is just, it's sort of kind of consonant with what Roopesh was saying about imagining otherwise worlds. Really, it's like sort of alternative futures that artists working with animation allow us to start to come to terms with, whether they're thinking about, you know, queer and trans identity, for example, otherwise worlds with other genders, or perhaps even non-gendered worlds, or if we're thinking about historical relationships to the surrounding environment in terms of indigenous cultures, and how that might be carried forward, and how that might offer us a sort of a model of how we might reorient ourselves and our relationship to each other and to the environment around us. So it's a sort of very kind of sprawling and multifaceted project necessarily, but it is talking about that kind of imaginative work, not only of thinking of the so-called future, but also thinking of how we might tell stories of our histories and our past in new ways. For me, that's a future-oriented project. It almost seems like contradictory to say that, but it is almost, it's positioning us, orienting us towards a different kind of way of relating to the history of colonization, of gender, of race, all those taxonomies, all those kind of orders of classification. So yeah, those things are necessarily connected, thinking the past and thinking the future for me.
Yes. Great. Back to the sovereign and the heterogeneity conflict.
Exactly.
Wonderful. You know, there's really, I think, a lot of resonance in the kinds of projects and practices that you guys are working with. And you know, it's really nice to be able to end this way, to kind of give us a hint of some of the problems and issues and tactics that maybe we can think about, so that cultural practice can move towards the social in very kind of deep and profound ways in the future. You know, we have to end this conversation, but I have a very strong feeling that, in fact, this conversation will continue. We're really only at the start of it, and there may be opportunities to explore ways of working together in the future because of these deep resonances. Tendai, we're going to have to bring you over to Malaysia at some point.
Oh, yes. Yes, we was.
I'd love that. Absolutely love that.
You must make an effort to do that.
Yeah, and carry on this this conversation. You know, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you guys, Tendai and Roopesh. It's really great, and I hope we can continue. Big thanks to Lucy for the interpretation work, and also to Shazza Ramli, who is not visible but always present behind the scenes. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Please make sure you catch a distinct order curated by Roopesh Sitharan, as well as Old World Order, New World Orders by Tendai John Mutambu. It's streaming 11th and 12th December. Rewatch it again after you've seen this talk, maybe. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.